Captain Matthew Ryan thought he owned the sky. He had 20 years of flight time, a massive ego, and a nasty habit of judging a book by its cover. So, when he saw a quiet black man sitting in seat 1A of his Boeing 737, he didn't just see a passenger, he saw a problem. He called him Unfit. He tried to kick him off. He thought he was clearing out the riffraff. But Matthew made one fatal calculation error. That man wasn't just a passenger. He was the one man in the United States with the power to ground Matthew for life. This is the story of the flight that never took off, and the career that crash-landed. The rain lashed against the reinforced glass of JFK's Terminal 4 like handfuls of gravel. It was a miserable Tuesday evening in November, the kind of weather that delayed flights, soured moods, and made the air inside the terminal thick with frustration. But inside the Sovereign Air Diamond Lounge, the air smelled of expensive roasting coffee and aged leather. Captain Richard Matthew Ryan adjusted the gold bars on his epaulets, catching his reflection in the dark window. At 52, Matthew was the poster boy for commercial aviation, square-jawed, silver-haired, and possessing a voice that sounded like it was dipped in bourbon and confidence. He was Sovereign Air's senior check airman. He didn't just fly the planes, he decided who else was good enough to fly them. "I'm telling you, Jerry," Matthew said, leaning back in his armchair and swirling his scotch, "the standards are slipping. We used to have the right stuff. Now, they're letting anyone into the cockpit just to fill quotas." Jerry, a younger first officer with nervous eyes, nodded quickly. "Right, Captain. Absolutely." Matthew took a sip, his eyes scanning the lounge. It was mostly empty, save for a few businessmen typing furiously on laptops and a family in the corner. Then, the lounge doors hissed open. A man walked in. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that fit him with the precision of armor. He was black, his hair cut close, his beard neatly trimmed with flecks of grey. He carried no luggage, only a slim, battered leather briefcase. He didn't look around with the wide-eyed wonder of a vacationer. He moved with the silent, predatory efficiency of a man who owned the room but didn't feel the need to say it. He walked to the concierge desk. Matthew watched him, his eyes narrowing. "Since when did they lower the diamond threshold?" he muttered to Jerry. "Guy looks like he should be handling my luggage, not drinking my scotch." Jerry winced. "Captain, keep it down. That suit looks expensive." "Knockoffs always look expensive from a distance, kid," Matthew scoffed. Matthew watched as the man handed a black card to the concierge. The young woman behind the desk, whose name tag read Emily, stiffened visibly. She typed something into her computer, her eyes widening. She stood up immediately, offering a slight bow. "Welcome, Mr. Thorne," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. We weren't expecting you on this flight. I can arrange a private suite if you'd prefer." The man, Mr. Thorne, shook his head. His voice was a low rumble, calm and steady. "No need, Emily. I'll sit by the window. I have some reading to do before we board." "Of course, sir." Thorne took his file and sat 3 tables away from Matthew. He didn't order a drink. He opened the briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of documents stamped with a red border, and began to read, clicking a silver pen rhythmically. Matthew felt a P-Matthew of irritation. He was the captain. Usually the concierge fawned over him. Who was this guy? A rapper? An athlete past his prime? Matthew stood up, buttoning his blazer. "Watch this," he whispered to Jerry. Matthew sauntered over to Thorne's table. He loomed over the seated man, casting a shadow across the documents. "You know," Matthew said, his voice projecting that practiced cockpit authority, "this area is usually reserved for frequent flyers, high-tier members. You might be more comfortable near the buffet, closer to the exit." Marcus Thorne didn't look up. He didn't even stop reading. He turned a page. The silence stretched for 5 agonizing seconds. "I'm talking to you, pal," Matthew said, his voice hardening. Thorne finally stopped. He slowly capped his pen. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Matthew's with a terrifying lack of emotion. There was no fear, no anger, just the bored patience of a lion watching a yapping dog. "I'm comfortable right here, Captain," Thorne said. He glanced at Matthew's name badge. "Ryan, Sovereign Air, Senior Pilot." "That's right," Matthew puffed his chest out. "Which means I know pretty much everyone who belongs in this lounge, and I don't know you." "There are many things you don't know, Captain Ryan," Thorne said softly. "I suggest you go finish your drink. You have a flight to Miami in 45 minutes. You'll need your focus." Matthew bristled. The dismissal was so total, so absolute, it felt like a slap. "Listen, buddy, if you're flying on my plane, you better show some respect. I decide who flies and who walks. Remember that." Thorne offered a faint, icy smile. "I'll keep that in mind." Matthew huffed and stormed back to Jerry. "Arrogant Matthew," he spat. "I bet he's some lottery winner upgrade. If he gives me one reason, just one reason, he's gone." Jerry looked at the man in the charcoal suit. "Captain, maybe we should just leave it alone. He has a look." "Yeah," Matthew sneered. "The look of trouble, and I don't haul trouble." Flight 492 to Miami was a Boeing 737 MAX, the pride of the sovereign fleet. The rain had intensified, turning the tarmac into a slick black mirror. Inside the cockpit, Matthew Ryan was running through the pre-flight checklist with a kind of aggressive speed. He was still fuming about the interaction in the lounge. It wasn't just the man's presence, it was his indifference. Matthew was used to being the most important man in the room. "Flaps set to 5, Jerry called out from the right seat. "Check," Matthew snapped. "Load sheet?" "Coming in now. Full flight in economy. First class is checked in full. We have a VIP manifest update." Matthew snatched the paper. "Who?" "Seat 1A, Jerry said. "The guy from the lounge, Marcus Thorne. The system has him flagged as Priority Do Not Disturb." Matthew stared at the name. Marcus Thorne. It sounded generic, unimportant. Priority my ass. Probably used miles. Matthew stood up. "I'm going to do a cabin walk. Check the galley supplies." "Captain, we push back in 10, Jerry warned. "I'm the captain, Jerry. We push back when I say we push back." Matthew opened the cockpit door and stepped into the galley. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, was arranging the pre-departure champagne. She was a veteran, 20 years in the air, and she knew Matthew's temper well. "Everything good, Matthew?" she asked, forcing a smile. "Fine," Matthew grunted. He peered around the curtain into the first-class cabin. The passengers were settling in. A tech CEO in 2B was on his phone. A socialite in 3A was adjusting her makeup. And there, in 1A, the prime seat, sat Marcus Thorne. He had removed his suit jacket, revealing a crisp white shirt and a dark vest. He was sipping water, still reading that file with the red border. He looked out of place. Not because of his race, though Matthew told himself that was it. It was because Thorne looked too serious for a vacation flight to Miami. Matthew stepped through the curtain. He needed to assert dominance. This was his ship. "Comfortable?" Matthew asked, stopping at row 1. Thorne looked up. "Perfectly. Thank you, Captain." "You know," Matthew said, leaning one hand on the overhead bin, invading Thorne's personal space. "Seat 1A is usually reserved for our Diamond Medallion members, people who have flown 1,000,000 miles with us. It's a seat for people who built this airline's reputation." Thorne placed his file down. "Is there a problem with my ticket, Captain Ryan?" No ticket problem, Matthew said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the surrounding passengers could clearly hear. It's just a culture fit issue. You see, we have a waiting list for this seat. A senator's wife is back in row 4. A woman of great importance. I see, Thorne said. And you think I should move? I think, Matthew smiled, a cold, shark-like expression, that a man like you would be happier in Economy Plus. More. Your speed. Less pressure to fit in. The cabin went quiet. The tech CEO stopped typing. The socialite lowered her compact. The racism was thinly veiled, wrapped in customer service speak, but it was as sharp as a razor. Thorne didn't blink. A man like me? You know, Matthew shrugged. New money. Upgrade vouchers. It's obvious. You don't want to be where you're not wanted, do you? Thorne slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up. He was eye level with Matthew now, and despite Matthew's uniform and hat, Thorne seemed significantly larger. Captain Ryan, Thorne said, his voice projecting to the back of first class. Are you formally asking me to vacate my seat based on your personal assessment of my fitness for first class? I'm giving you a choice, Matthew said, crossing his arms. Move to row 12 or get off my plane. I don't like your attitude. And under FAA regulations, if I feel a passenger is a disruption or a threat to the safety of the flight, I can remove them. A threat? Thorne raised an eyebrow. Reading a file is a threat? Your attitude is a threat, Matthew lied. You were aggressive in the lounge. You're being aggressive now. I don't fly with aggressive passengers. Sarah, the flight attendant, rushed over. Captain Ryan, sir. Mr. Thorne has been perfectly polite. Quiet, Sarah, Matthew snapped. He turned back to Thorne. Well, row 12 or the terminal? Thorne looked at Sarah, giving her a reassuring nod. Then he looked at Matthew. I will not move to row 12, Thorne said. Then get off, Matthew pointed to the door. Now, or I call the police. Thorne picked up his jacket. He picked up his briefcase. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He looked at Matthew with a mixture of pity and finality. Very well, Thorne said. I will deplane. But, Captain, you should know, once I step off this aircraft, this flight is cancelled. Matthew laughed, a loud, barking laugh. Who do you think you are? God? Get out! Thorne walked to the door. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he turned back one last time. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Ryan. It will be your last one in that uniform. Matthew felt a rush of adrenaline. He had won. He had cleared the cabin of the problem. He turned to the stunned first-class passengers. Sorry about that, folks. Just keeping the skies friendly and safe. Sometimes you have to weed out the bad apples. He expected applause. He got silence. The tech CEO in 2B looked disgusted. That guy was just sitting there, Captain. Trust me, Matthew said, waving a hand. I have a sixth sense for trouble. He walked back into the cockpit, slamming the door. He's gone, Matthew announced, strapping into his seat. Let's get this bird in the air. Jerry, call for pushback. Jerry looked pale. He was holding the flight tablet, his hand shaking. Captain, Jerry whispered. We have a message from the tower, and one from dispatch, and one from corporate. They can wait, Matthew said, reaching for the throttle. No, Captain, they can't. Jerry turned the screen toward Matthew. Ground control has denied our pushback clearance. They've put a hard hold on us. What? Why? The weather? No, sir. Administrative hold. Order came directly from the FAA field office. Matthew frowned. FAA, what is this? Suddenly, the cockpit printer, the A-CARS system, began to chatter, spitting out a long strip of paper. Then the radio crackled to life. It wasn't the usual rhythmic cadence of the tower controllers. It was a serious, deep voice. Sovereign 492, this is Kennedy Tower. Hold position immediately. Shut down engines. Matthew keyed the mic. Tower, this is Sovereign 492. We are fully boarded and ready to go. What's the delay? Sovereign 492. Do not, repeat, do not spool engines. Police and Port Authority are en route to your aircraft. You are to remain in the cockpit. Matthew's stomach dropped. Police? For the guy I kicked off? Did he make a bomb threat? Jerry was reading the ACR's printout. His face went from pale to ghostly white. He looked at Matthew, his eyes wide with horror. Matthew, Jerry said, dropping the captain title. Oh my God, Matthew! What? Matthew snatched the paper. The message was flagged. Urgent, do not depart. It read, from Federal Aviation Administration, Office of the Administrator, to Sovereign Air Ops, Flight 492. Subject, immediate grounding of pilot Richard Ryan. Message, pilot in command has removed a federal officer without cause. The individual removed was Director Marcus Thorne, FAA Regional Administrator and Chief Auditor of Flight Standards. Captain Ryan is hereby suspended pending immediate investigation. Matthew read it twice. The words swam before his eyes. Director, FAA Regional Administrator, Chief Auditor, the man in the lounge, the riffraff. The man he had told was unfit for VIP. That man wasn't just a VIP. That man was the boss of the boss of the boss. Marcus Thorne was the man who signed the certificates that allowed airlines to exist. He was the man who oversaw pilot licensing. Matthew had just kicked the personification of the Federal Aviation Administration off his plane for being black. He didn't say who he was, Matthew stammered, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. He didn't identify himself. He tried, Jerry said quietly. You didn't let him. A heavy knock pounded on the cockpit door. Sarah opened it. She didn't look friendly anymore. Captain, there are 4 officers here, and a man in a trench coat from the NTSB. They want you. Now. Matthew looked out the cockpit window. Below on the rainy tarmac, a cavalcade of black SUVs had surrounded the plane. Blue and red lights reflected off the wet pavement. Standing right by the front landing gear, holding an umbrella and looking up at the cockpit window, was Marcus Thorne. He wasn't angry. He was just waiting. Matthew Ryan froze. His hands, usually so steady on the yoke, were trembling so violently he couldn't undo his seatbelt. I can fix this, Matthew whispered, his voice cracking. It's just a misunderstanding. Jerry unbuckled his own harness and stood up, grabbing his kit bag. No, Matthew, it's not. I'm not flying with you. I'm not losing my license because I sat next to you. Jerry walked out. Matthew was alone in the cockpit. The king of the sky had just been dethroned. The silence in the cockpit was heavier than the roar of any engine Matthew Ryan had ever commanded. It was a suffocating, physical weight that pressed against his chest. Outside, the rain drummed a relentless, mocking rhythm against the windshield. Tap, 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 like a judge's gavel striking over and over again. Matthew's hands were still gripping the armrests of his seat, his knuckles white. The blood drained from them just as it had drained from his face. He stared at the instrument panel, the glowing dials, the artificial horizon, the flight management computer. For 30 years, this had been his altar. He was the high priest of this metal temple. But now, the temple had locked him out. Captain Ryan? The voice came from behind him. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Jerry. It was a baritone voice, flat and devoid of warmth. Matthew slowly turned his head. 2 Port Authority officers stood in the cramped doorway of the cockpit. Behind them, a man in a dark trench coat, the NTSB representative, watched with clinical detachment. I need you to step out of the seat, sir, the lead officer said. He didn't say captain. He said sir, but with the tone one uses for a drunk driver found asleep at the wheel. "This is—" Matthew's voice was a dry, raspy squeak. He cleared his throat, trying to summon the bourbon-soaked authority he had wielded an hour ago. "This is a misunderstanding. I want to speak to the chief pilot. I want a union rep." "You can make your calls from the station," the officer said, stepping into the cockpit. The space was too small for aggression, which made the officer's intrusion feel even more violated. "Please don't make us assist you, Mr. Ryan." "Mr. Ryan." Not Captain. The stripping of his rank had already begun. Matthew unbuckled the 4-point harness. The click of the metal latch sounded like a gunshot in the quiet space. He tried to stand, but his knees were water. He grabbed the glare shield to steady himself. "My jacket," Matthew mumbled, reaching for his blazer with the 4 gold stripes. "Leave it," the officer said. "It's my uniform," Matthew snapped, a spark of his old arrogance flaring up. "I'm not walking out there in my shirt sleeves like a rookie." "Grab the jacket," the NTSB man said, checking his watch. "Let's just move. The airport is gridlocked because of your plane blocking the apron." Matthew grabbed the blazer, pulling it on. He smoothed the lapels, desperate to look composed. He put his cap on, angling it low over his eyes. If he couldn't control the situation, he could at least hide his fear. He stepped out of the cockpit and into the galley. Sarah was standing there, her arms crossed tight against her chest, hugging herself. She had flown with Matthew for 6 years. She had laughed at his jokes, tolerated his moods, and covered for his rudeness. But now she wouldn't look at him. She was staring at the floor, her face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. "Sarah," Matthew whispered, "you know I followed protocol. You saw him. He was aggressive." Sarah looked up then. Her eyes were wet, but her expression was hard. "He was reading a book, Matthew. He was reading a damn book." "Let's go," the officer said, placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder. They marched him through the curtain into the first-class cabin. This was the walk Matthew usually loved. The victory lap, he called it. Greeting the VIPs, flashing that winning smile, accepting the silent admiration of the wealthy and powerful. Now, it was a gauntlet. The cabin was dead silent. Every single passenger was watching him. The tech CEO in 2B, the man who had witnessed the eviction of Marcus Thorne, locked eyes with Matthew. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He slowly shook his head, a gesture of pity that hurt Matthew more than a punch. The socialite in 3A held her phone up. The camera lens pointed squarely at Matthew's face. He realized with a sick lurch that she was live streaming. "That's him," she whispered to her phone. "That's the pilot who kicked off the FAA director. Look at him." Matthew looked down at his feet. He focused on the blue carpet pattern. Left foot, right foot. Just get to the door. Just get to the door. He could feel their judgment burning into his skin. He heard a whisper from row 4. "Racist." He flinched. They reached the aircraft door. The cold, damp air of the jet bridge hit him. It smelled of jet fuel and ozone. But the ordeal wasn't over. As he stepped onto the metal walkway of the bridge, he saw that the reception committee wasn't just police. Standing at the end of the jet bridge, framed by the sterile white lights of the terminal, stood a group of men in suits. In the center was the station manager for Sovereign Air, looking like he was about to vomit. And next to him, perfectly dry, holding his leather briefcase, was Marcus Thorne. Thorne didn't look triumphant. He didn't have a smirk on his face. He looked bureaucratic. He looked like a man who was looking at a column of numbers that didn't add up. Matthew stopped. The officers nudged him forward. "Captain Ryan," the station manager said, his voice trembling, "hand over your ID badge and your airport security credentials. Immediately." "Now wait a minute, Bob," Matthew pleaded. his hands shaking as he reached for the lanyard around his neck. "You can't suspend me right here. There's a process, a hearing." "The hearing will happen," Marcus Thorne spoke up. His voice was low, smooth, and terrified Matthew to his core. "But until then, you are a security risk." Matthew looked at Thorne. "I didn't know who you were." Thorne stepped closer. The space between them seemed to vibrate with tension. "That is exactly the problem, Mr. Ryan," Thorne said. "You treated me with contempt because you thought I was nobody. You thought I was powerless. You thought my black face and my quiet demeanor meant I didn't belong in your world." Thorne leaned in, his voice dropping so only Matthew could hear. "If you had treated a janitor the way you treated me, I would still be taking your license today. The fact that I am the director is just the cosmic joke that makes sure it sticks. I thought you were a threat to the flight," Matthew lied, clinging to his only defense. Thorne opened his briefcase. He pulled out the file he had been reading on the plane. He held it up. "Do you know what this is, Matthew?" Thorne asked. Matthew squinted at the cover. "It's the Sovereign Air Diversity and Inclusion Audit, Q3, Thorne read the title. "I wasn't flying to Miami for a vacation. I was flying to Miami to meet with your CEO about the systemic culture of bias reported in your pilot ranks. I decided to fly commercial, incognito, to see if the reports were true." Matthew's knees finally gave out. He stumbled, catching himself on the railing of the jet bridge. The irony was a physical blow. Thorne was there to investigate the very thing Matthew had just demonstrated in high definition. Matthew hadn't just stepped on a landmine. He had jumped on it with both feet while the bomb disposal expert watched. "You proved my thesis before we even left the gate," Thorne said, closing the file. "Officers, remove him from the secure area." "Wait!" Matthew cried out as the officers grabbed his arms. "My pension! I'm 3 years from retirement. You can't destroy 30 years of service for one mistake." Thorne watched him being dragged away, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't a mistake, Mr. Ryan," Thorne called out to the retreating figure. "It was a choice, and now you have to live with it." They didn't take Matthew to jail. In some ways, where they took him was worse. They marched him through the terminal, past the curious eyes of hundreds of travelers, to the airport administration wing. They placed him in Conference Room B, a room with glass walls on 3 sides, visible to everyone walking down the main corridor. It was the fishbowl. They took his phone, they took his belt, they sat him at a long, empty table and left him there. For an hour, Matthew sat alone. He watched the airport operate without him. He saw planes taking off in the distance, planes he was qualified to fly, planes he would never fly again. He saw crews walking by in their uniforms, laughing, dragging their roller bags. Some of them glanced into the glass room, saw him, and did a double take. He saw the whispers start, the text messages being sent. "Did you see Matthew Ryan in the fishbowl? Looks like he's crying." He wasn't crying. Not yet. He was in a state of shock, his mind racing through a maze of what-ifs. What if I had just let him sit there? What if I had brought him a drink? What if I had just kept my mouth shut in the lounge? The door opened. It wasn't a lawyer. It was Sovereign Air's chief pilot, Captain David Miller. Miller was a man Matthew had known for 20 years. They had attended barbecues together. Their wives played tennis. Miller looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He walked in, carrying a folder, and didn't offer a hand. He didn't sit down. "David," Matthew breathed, standing up. "Thank God. Look, you have to talk to them. This guy, Thorne, he entrapped me. He provoked me." "Sit down, Matthew," Miller said. His voice was cold steel. Matthew sat slowly. "Entrapment." Miller threw a stack of papers onto the table. I just watched the CCTV footage from the lounge, Matthew. I listened to the audio recording from the cockpit voice recorder, which, by the way, captures everything you say before the engines start, too. Miller leaned his hands on the table, looming over his friend. You called him riff-raff to Jerry. You told him he belonged in the back because he was a culture-fit issue. You threatened to arrest a federal officer because he wouldn't move seats to accommodate a hypothetical senator's wife who wasn't even on the manifest. Matthew stammered. I was protecting the brand. We keep first-class exclusive. Exclusive? Miller shouted, his face turning red. You made us look like a relic from the 1950s. Do you have any idea what's happening on social media right now? Sovereign Racist is trending #1 globally. Globally, Matthew, our stock dropped 4% in the last 40 minutes. Matthew blanched. I didn't mean to. And the worst part, Miller said, lowering his voice to a disgusted hiss. The absolute worst part is that Marcus Thorne is the one man. The one man who was advocating for Sovereign Air to get the new international routes to Tokyo. We needed his sign-off next week. Miller pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder. It was Sovereign Air letterhead. He's not signing off on the routes, Matthew, and I'm not signing off on you. Miller slid the paper across the table. What is this? Matthew asked, his vision blurring. Termination for cause, Miller said. Effective immediately. Loss of seniority. Loss of pension, benefits related to conduct violations. And we are cooperating fully with the FAA's investigation into your revocation. You can't take my pension, Matthew whispered. I earned that. Read the morality clause in your contract, Miller said, turning to leave. You violated the core values of the company in a public setting while in uniform. You're done. David, please, Matthew begged, tears finally spilling over. I have a mortgage, my daughter's college tuition. I don't know how to do anything else. I'm a pilot. That's all I am. Miller stopped at the door. He looked back, and for a second, Matthew saw a flush of pity, but it was quickly replaced by resignation. You were a pilot, Matthew, Miller said. Now, you're a liability. Miller walked out, leaving Matthew alone in the glass box. Outside the glass, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, but inside, Matthew Ryan's world had gone completely dark. He put his head in his hands, covering his face, trying to hide from the hundreds of eyes passing by. But he couldn't hide. The glass walls reflected his own image back at him, a man in a uniform that no longer meant anything. The door opened again. Matthew looked up, expecting the police to escort him out. It was Marcus Thorne. He was alone. No briefcase. No entourage. He walked into the room and pulled out the chair opposite Matthew. He sat down, crossing his hands on the table. He looked at the broken man across from him. Why are you here? Matthew croaked. To gloat? You won. I'm dead. Career over. I don't gloat, Mr. Ryan, Thorne said calmly. And I didn't come here to see you suffer. I came here to ask you one question, and I want an honest answer. It's the only thing that might save a fraction of your dignity. Matthew wiped his nose with his sleeve. What? Thorne's eyes bored into him, deep and searching. When you saw me in the lounge, Thorne said. Before I spoke, before I showed you my ticket. What was the very first thing you thought? Matthew opened his mouth to lie, to say he thought Thorne looked suspicious, to say he looked like a security risk. But the energy to lie was gone. He was empty. He looked at the black man in the suit. He thought about the 20 years of jokes he'd made in the cockpit, the assumptions, the feeling that the cockpit was a white man's sanctuary. Matthew slumped. I thought you didn't belong. Because of my race? Thorne asked, Matthew nodded slowly. Yes. Thorne nodded. He stood up. Thank you for the truth, Thorne said. It doesn't change the outcome, but admitting the sickness is the first step to curing it. You won't fly again, Matthew, but maybe, just maybe, you can learn to be a human being on the ground. Thorne turned and walked to the door. Wait, Matthew said. Thorne paused. What happens to me now? Thorne looked back. Now? You experience what it feels like to be powerless. It's a lesson you're 50 years late for. Thorne left. The walk from the administration wing to the curbside pickup was the longest mile Matthew Ryan had ever traveled. He had flown over oceans, navigated through typhoons, and landed crippled aircraft in blinding snowstorms. But walking through the arrivals hall of JFK Terminal 4, stripped of his ID badge, carrying his blazer over his arm like a dead animal, was a terror he was unprepared for. He wasn't anonymous anymore. The video the socialite had live-streamed hadn't just gone viral. It had gone supernova. In the 2 hours Matthew had spent in the fishbowl, the clip had been viewed 4 million times. It had jumped from TikTok to Twitter, and from Twitter to the chyrons of CNN and Fox News. Pilot Profile's FAA director claims unfit for first class. Matthew kept his head down, pulling his cap low, but the air around him felt charged. He heard the whispers ripple through the crowd like a wave. That's him. Hey, look, it's the racist pilot. Mr. Ryan, hey, look over here. A blinding flash went off, then another. Matthew looked up, startled. A cluster of paparazzi and freelance stringers had already gathered at the sliding glass doors. They were like vultures sensing a carcass. Captain Ryan, a reporter with a microphone shouted, shoving it into Matthew's face as he stepped into the humid night air. Did you know he was the director? Would you have kicked him off if he was white? No comment, Matthew muttered, shouldering past them. Your co-pilot says you used a racial slur in the cockpit, another reporter yelled. Matthew stopped. The blood drained from his face. Jerry had already talked. The betrayal felt like a knife in the ribs. That's a lie, Matthew snapped, turning back for a split second. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing his snarl, his sweat, his disheveled hair. It was the photo that would grace the front page of the New York Post the next morning, with the headline, Grounded. He hailed a cab, practically diving into the back seat. Just drive, Matthew gasped. Get me out of here. The driver, a Sikh man in a turban, looked at Matthew in the rearview mirror. He looked at the uniform trousers, the pilot shirt, and the desperate expression. The driver didn't say a word. He just turned the radio up. The news was playing. Sovereign Air stock has plummeted 7% in after-hours trading following the incident. The NTOT-ACP has issued a statement calling for a full audit of the airline's hiring practices. Meanwhile, sources say Captain Richard Ryan had 3 prior complaints against him for similar behavior, all of which were sealed by the airline. Until now. Matthew closed his eyes and leaned his head against the cold window. The rain had started again. The city lights blurred into streaks of red and gold, dissolving just like his future. The house in Greenwich, Connecticut, was usually Matthew's sanctuary. It was a sprawling colonial with a manicured lawn and a 3-car garage, the tangible proof of his success. Tonight, it looked dark. Matthew unlocked the front door. The house was silent. The smell of roasted chicken hung in the air, cold and stale. "Linda," he called out. His voice echoed. He walked into the kitchen. His wife, Linda, was sitting at the granite island. She wasn't cooking. She wasn't cleaning. She was sitting with a glass of white wine in one hand and her iPad in the other. She didn't look up when he entered. "Linda, honey, it's a mess," Matthew began, rushing his words. "But I can fix it. It's a misunderstanding. The union will—" "Stop," Linda said. Her voice was brittle. She turned the iPad around. It was paused on the video. The moment where Matthew pointed at the door and told Marcus Thorne to get out. "I've been watching this for 3 hours, Matthew," she said softly. "I've watched it 50 times. "They edited it," Matthew lied, walking to the fridge to get a beer. His hands were shaking so bad he dropped the bottle opener. "Don't lie to me." Linda stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Do not lie to me, Matthew. Not about this." She walked over to him, her eyes red from crying. "My sister called me from California. She saw it. My mother called. The neighbors—" "Matthew, the neighbors turned off their porch lights when your cab pulled up." "Screw the neighbors," Matthew shouted, the stress finally exploding. "I made a mistake. One mistake in 30 years. "Is it?" Linda asked. She looked at him with a stranger's eyes. "Is it really? Or is this just the first time you got caught? Because I've heard you talk, Matthew. I've heard what you say about the new hires. I've heard the jokes you make at parties when you've had too much scotch." Matthew stared at her. "Whose side are you on?" "I'm on the side of not losing everything," she cried. "But it's too late, isn't it? The pension, the benefits, it's all tied to your standing. If they fire you for cause—" She trailed off, looking around the kitchen. The granite, the stainless steel appliances, the life they had built. "We can't afford this house without your flight pay, Matthew." Matthew slumped against the counter. The reality of the economics hit him harder than the shame. He was leveraged to the hilt. Private school tuitions, the boat, the cars. It all depended on that $300,000 salary. "I'll get a lawyer," Matthew whispered. "A shark. We'll sue for wrongful termination." Linda finished her wine in one gulp and set the glass down. "You better hope he's good," she said, walking out of the room. "Because you're not just fighting an airline, Matthew. You're fighting the internet. And the internet never forgets." Three months later. The hearing room at the Federal Aviation Administration's regional office in Garden City was sterile, gray, and freezing cold. It wasn't a criminal court, but it felt like an execution chamber. Matthew sat at a long mahogany table. He had lost 20 pounds. His suit hung loosely on his frame. His skin was sallow, the result of months of insomnia and drinking. Next to him sat his attorney, a heavily gelled man named Mr. Fielder, who cost $600 an hour, money Matthew had to pull from his 401k to pay. Across the room sat the panel, 3 administrative law judges from the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, and to their right, at the witness table, sat Marcus Thorne. Thorne looked exactly the same as he had on the plane, calm, impeccable. He wore a navy suit and reading glasses. He didn't look at Matthew. He looked at the documents in front of him. "This hearing is now in session," the lead administrator said. "Matter of the FAA versus Richard Ryan. License revocation proceedings regarding Airman Certificate number 49 New Tazu Zulu 11. The proceedings were slow and agonizing. They didn't shout, they didn't pound gavels, they simply dissected Matthew's career with surgical precision. They played the cockpit voice recorder audio. The room listened in silence as Matthew's voice filled the air. "Look at this guy. Probably a rapper. Unfit for VIP." Matthew closed his eyes. Hearing his own voice, dripping with unprovoked malice, was nauseating. In the sterile light of the hearing room, stripped of the locker room atmosphere of the pilot's lounge, the words sounded monstrous. Mr. Fielder, Matthew's lawyer, stood up. "Honorable members of the board," Fielder began, adjusting his tie. "My client admits to a lapse in judgment regarding his choice of words. However, his actions, asking a passenger to move, were based on a perceived security concern. Captain Ryan believed the passenger was exhibiting non-compliant behavior. This is a safety issue, not a bias issue. The lead administrator looked over his glasses. Mr. Fielder, we have the testimony of the first officer, the lead flight attendant, and 3 passengers. All of them state that Mr. Thorne was reading a file and drinking water. What non-compliant behavior are you referring to? He refused a direct order from the captain, Fielder stammered. Marcus Thorne leaned forward toward the microphone. May I speak? Thorne asked. Director Thorne, the floor is yours, the administrator said. Thorne took off his glasses. He looked across the room, finally locking eyes with Matthew. Security is the bedrock of aviation, Thorne began, his voice deep and resonant. A captain has absolute authority. We grant them that power because we trust their judgment. We trust that when they look at a situation, they see risk, not race. They see danger, not difference. Thorne paused, letting the words hang in the air. Captain Ryan's defense is that he made a security call, but the evidence shows he made a social call. He decided that a black man in a 3-piece suit did not fit his mental model of a first-class passenger. He used his authority not to protect the plane, but to protect his own prejudice. Thorne opened a folder. Since this incident, my office has conducted a retroactive audit of Captain Ryan's career. We found 7 other instances where minority passengers were removed from his flights for security concerns that were later deemed unsubstantiated. A Sikh doctor, a Latino grandmother, 2 young black students. Matthew's head snapped up. That's circumstantial. It is a pattern, Thorne said firmly. Mr. Ryan, you are not here because you made one mistake. You are here because you have been using the federal aviation regulations as a weapon to enforce your own bigotry. And today, I am taking that weapon away. The lead administrator nodded. He didn't need to deliberate. The 3 judges exchanged a quick glance and nodded in unison. Mr. Ryan, please stand, the administrator said. Matthew stood up. His legs felt like lead. Based on the preponderance of evidence, and under the authority of Title 49 of the United States Code, we find that you lack the good moral character required to hold an airman certificate. Furthermore, your actions constitute a violation of Federal Aviation Regulation 91.13, careless and reckless operation, by creating an undue hazard to the safety and order of the flight. The gavel was raised. It is the judgment of this board that your airline transport pilot license is hereby revoked permanently. You are disqualified from holding any airman certificate in the United States. Bang! The sound of the gavel was final. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on 30 years of life. Matthew stood there, swaying. Permanently? He whispered. I can't fly cargo. I can't teach. You are grounded, Mr. Ryan, the administrator said, closing his file. For life. You are dismissed. Matthew turned to look at Thorne. He wanted to scream. He wanted to beg. But Thorne was already packing his briefcase. He closed it with a sharp click, stood up, and walked out of the room without giving Matthew a second glance. Matthew was left standing in the empty room with his expensive lawyer who had lost. Well, Fielder said, clicking his pen, we could appeal to the full NTSB board, but it'll cost another $20,000. And honestly, Matthew, you don't have a prayer. Matthew didn't answer. He walked out of the room, into the hallway, and saw a janitor mopping the floor. The janitor was an older black man. He stopped mopping as Matthew walked by. He looked at Matthew, recognized him from the news, and just shook his head slowly. Matthew kept walking, but he had nowhere to go. It was a Tuesday in November, exactly 1 year to the day since Flight 492 never took off. The rain was falling again at JFK, turning the tarmac into a blur of grey and neon, but Matthew Ryan wasn't watching it from the cockpit of a Boeing 737. He was watching it through the cracked, smeary windshield of a park and save shuttle bus. Matthew shifted gears, the transmission grinding loudly. His back ached. He was wearing a uniform, but it wasn't the crisp navy blazer with gold stripes. It was a cheap, bright yellow polo shirt with a stain on the collar that read, "Driver" on the back. "Hey buddy, can you move it?" a passenger shouted from the back of the bus. "I'm going to miss my flight." "We're moving, sir," Matthew muttered, staring at the brake lights ahead. "Traffic at Terminal 4 is backed up." "Well, drive around them. Do you know how to drive or not?" The man snapped. Matthew gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. A year ago, he would have had this man thrown off the bus. He would have commanded respect. Now, he swallowed the insult like a bitter pill. He needed this job. The legal fees had drained his savings. The wrongful termination suit had failed. His wife, Linda, had filed for divorce 3 months after the license revocation, taking the house in Greenwich and leaving him with a mountain of debt and a studio apartment in Queens that smelled of boiled cabbage and regret. The bus hissed to a halt in front of the terminal, the very same doors he used to walk through with his head held high. "All out for Terminal 4, Matthew called out, his voice raspy. He got out into the rain to help with the luggage. The passenger, a young man in a suit who looked just like the tech CEO from that fateful flight, tossed his heavy bag at Matthew. "Careful with that," the man said, not even looking at Matthew. "It's worth more than your bus." Matthew hauled the heavy bag onto the curb, the rain soaking his yellow shirt. "Have a safe flight," Matthew whispered. The man didn't answer. He was already checking his phone, walking away. As Matthew wiped the rain from his eyes, a movement caught his attention near the first-class entrance. A flight crew was walking out. Leading the pack was a captain. He looked confident, sharp, and happy. He was laughing at something the first officer said. Matthew squinted. It was Jerry. The nervous, stuttering co-pilot who used to fetch Matthew's coffee was now a captain. He wore the 4 stripes on his shoulder. He looked like he owned the sky. Matthew felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to shout, to wave, to say hello. "Jerry, it's me." "Matthew." But he froze. Shame, hot and heavy, nailed his feet to the pavement. As Jerry passed by the shuttle bus, his eyes flickered over Matthew. For a second, their eyes met. Matthew waited for a nod, a smile, a sign of recognition. Jerry's expression didn't change. He looked right through Matthew, as if he were part of the scenery, just another invisible service worker in a yellow shirt. Jerry turned back to his crew and kept walking. Matthew had become exactly what he used to despise. A nobody. Just then, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb ahead of the shuttle. A driver hopped out and opened the rear door with an umbrella ready. A tall black man stepped out. He was impeccable in a charcoal suit. It was Marcus Thorne. Matthew felt his breath stop. Thorne looked older, perhaps a bit more tired, but he carried an air of undeniable dignity. He wasn't looking at files or phones. He was looking up at the sky, watching a jet tear through the clouds. Matthew stood by the open door of his shuttle, paralyzed. He was 10 feet away. He could say something. He could apologize. He could ask for forgiveness. But as he watched, a young pilot ran up to Thorne to shake his hand. Thorne smiled warmly, clapping the young pilot on the shoulder, offering encouragement. He treated the junior pilot with more respect than Matthew had ever shown anyone in 30 years. Matthew realized then that his punishment wasn't just losing the job. It was seeing the world move on without him. The industry he loved was better off without him. The skies were friendlier, safer, and more open because he was no longer in them. "Hey, driver!" A new passenger banged on the side of the bus. "Are we going or what? It's freezing out here." Matthew looked at Thorne one last time. Thorne turned to enter the terminal, disappearing into the warm, golden light of the entrance. The gateway to the world Matthew was exiled from forever. Matthew looked down at his wet, yellow shirt. He looked at the muddy tires of the shuttle bus. "Yeah," Matthew said, his voice breaking as he climbed back into the driver's seat. "We're going." He closed the door, shutting out the view of the terminal. He put the bus in gear and drove away from the airport, merging into the heavy traffic, just another face in the rain, grounded for life. Matthew Ryan spent his life believing that his uniform made him superior, and that respect was something you demanded, not something you earned. He judged Marcus Thorne based on the color of his skin, assuming that excellence couldn't look like him. In the end, Matthew didn't just lose his wings, he lost his place in the world. The tragic irony is that the riffraff he tried to remove was the very person protecting the integrity of the profession Matthew claimed to love. Matthew's ego wrote a check that his career couldn't cash, and the karma he faced wasn't just swift, it was absolute. He learned too late that when you try to push others down to make yourself feel tall, you eventually end up on your knees. What do you think? Did Captain Ryan deserve a lifetime ban, or was the punishment too harsh? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of high-altitude justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more stories about karma hitting back when people least expect it, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching, and remember, treat everyone with respect, because you never know who you're really talking to.